Hello everybody, in this little series of 3 episodes I want to speak about the question how to find the perfect fitting race bike frame. So if we want to talk about that question and want to answer that question, I think we can split it up into 3 different topics. So if you want to find the perfect fitting frame, you first should find the ideal position of an athlete. And then once the athlete is in a perfect position, then you can speak about the design of the frame. That would be part 2 of the series, how to design the frame after the athlete is positioned in a perfect way. And then in the end, so we position the athlete and we design the frame. Then you might want to build the frame, and then I have a few thoughts about how to build the frame in a smooth way. That's then part 3 of that series. So we then start with part 1 of this series, how to find the ideal position of an athlete, and we focus on a race bike frame right now. So if we ask ourselves how can we describe the position of an athlete, we have to speak about the rider's system, let's call it like this first. So what are the defined focus points we might use to then later on build a frame and to describe what is the concrete position of an athlete. So it's obvious that if you use a handlebar, a saddle and cranks, it's really hard to describe the concrete geometry of a handlebar, because you have a lot of different handlebar types, you have a lot of different saddles, and you have a 3D geometry of the saddle. So it's really hard to describe in terms of data something about the surface of the saddle and so on. So that's the reason why I think it's the best way, if we speak about the position of an athlete, the best way would be like just choose your handlebar, choose the right saddle, the right cranks and pedals, and just use those 3 technical parts to simulate the position in general. So if we talk about a rider system, then I would basically say it's necessary to include the handlebar, the saddle and the pedals, including cranks, or at least crank length, to the rider, and that's our rider system. And then if we do it like that, it's easy to describe where we then have our concrete points we are focusing on, because that's basically the clamping point of the handlebar, and it's the clamp point of the saddle in relation to the bracket center. So then it's easy to describe. So if I move around the athlete with this chosen saddle and handlebar and crank length, somehow in the space, it's easy to describe if I focus on these 3 points. So basically bracket center is the center, and then in relation, as I explained, we have center of handlebar, and we have the center of the clamp point where I clamp the saddle. So then it's really easy, because that's just a point in relation to bracket center, and that's it. So let's have a look at our system one more time. And well, I think if you want to position an athlete, often you are some kind of irritated by the frame itself, because if you focus on a bicycle frame, you have a fixed bottom bracket, and then in relation to the bottom bracket you can move the saddle, you can move the handlebar. But if we focus on a human being, it's literally it's a mechanical system. We have pivots and we have levers, and that's it. And well, of course, if we focus on a bicycle rider, we have a hip joint right here, and then somehow we have an upper body, and we have a lower body, the legs and the feet. And somehow the basic question is it really correct to keep in mind, you know, you have a fixed bottom bracket, and in relation to your bottom bracket you move the saddle and the handlebar. And I think that's not the correct way. The correct way would be more like take this hip joint as a fixed point in general, and then in relation to this hip joint you should then have the possibility to move somehow the legs, maybe in polar coordinates. That means with a radius, length of a radius, and then around the hip joint, and then somehow focus on the upper body. And so the best idea in my eyes would be you know, get away from this bike frame world and then focus on the human being, and then let's get familiar with the idea of moving the lower body and the upper body independently. And if we have a look at existing positioning jigs, this is a mechanical example of an existing jig, and if we focus on that, we can still see we have a fixed bottom bracket right here, and in relation to the bottom bracket I can somehow move the saddle, and I can move the handlebar as well. So of course you put in your handlebar, then you put in your saddle, and then you can somehow move everything. So what happens right here? So if I move the saddle, so the good idea is with this jig, there's the rotation idea, let's call it like this, is already included. So if I rotate the saddle, that's not too bad, because then I rotate around this bottom bracket, and I will move the handlebar at the same time, so that's not that bad. It's close to the idea that if I move the saddle, because I want to somehow work on the position of the legs, I'm not influencing the upper body. And that's not totally correct, because if we have a close look like here, so what I'm doing while I'm rotating the saddle, of course, then I have a movement, let's call it a movement of this fixed saddle point. I have a movement, a horizontal movement, I have a vertical movement like this, but at the same time I have a kind of rotation of the saddle, and that's not good, because I'm then rotating the saddle. I don't have the saddle in the same position anymore. And then if we have a close look at the handlebar, so this is a very small amount of vertical movement, but I have no vertical movement right here, because it just slides through here. And of course it's not the same amount in the horizontal way. So if the saddle has a movement like x1, the x2, that's not exactly the same. So that's not really super bad. It's a quite good idea, but it's not perfect, because what happens if you move your saddle up and down? Then okay, then you're influencing let's say the legs, the lower body section, and of course you're destroying the upper body section at the same time. So there's interference between upper and lower body, and we don't want that interference. So what then may be the best idea about a jig, to really keep in mind that we have an upper and a lower body, and we want to move upper and lower body independently. So let's jump on to the next slide, and as we can see right here, this is an example. It's a drawing of a perfect positioning jig. And how is that designed? It's designed in a way that you can see we have a fixed saddle right here, and then we have a bottom bracket that moves around in polar coordinates, moves around around a virtual pivot. So the virtual pivot is then exactly where, what means exactly, it's where the average pivot of the hip joint of an athlete might be. And if we then rotate around this virtual pivot right here, because we have then here designed this in a way like that, And if we rotate then the bottom bracket around this virtual pivot, so we have then no influence on the upper body. It will stay as it is. And at the one time, and on the other side, if we rotate around the virtual pivot point, the position of the lever itself in relation to each other, so the legs, that's basically exactly the same. We're not influencing some kind of saddle height, because it's exactly a rotation around this central pivot point of this lever system. So that might be an idea of a perfect positioning jig. And as you can see right here, I already designed many years ago a prototype, and this exactly works as we saw it on the previous page. I have this design in the way that I'm rotating then around a virtual pivot point right here, and if I rotate, as I explained, around this virtual pivot point, the lever system will stay exactly the same. It's just the position of the legs in general have a different position of it without influencing the lever system. And then of course the upper body will stay as it is. There's no influence to the upper body. And the other way around, of course. And then if you have a close look like this, you can see I have a weight measuring system right here. I will talk about that, the functionality of that later on, because that's really it's a really important fact to understand why I have a weight measuring system right here and what is it good for. I will explain it in a few minutes. So this is a different example. It's a different jig. Basically it works exactly the same. I have a system designed like this that leads to a virtual pivot point around hip joint of the athlete, and then you can modify the position of bottom bracket. You can rotate around this pivot point here, and then you can of course slide it up and down to, let's say, modify the saddle height in an intelligent way. So the difference right here is, of course, that's made of sheet metal, and the positioning of the handlebar, that's no longer in polar coordinates. You can slide the handlebar back and forth, and you can change the height of the handlebar in X and Y coordinates. But because with the upper body, I think it's not that important, because you're not playing around with the bottom bracket position. That's more relevant for the positioning system, for the positioning procedure of the legs. So if you would have a jig like this, what are the advantages of a jig like that? So you have independent focus on upper and lower body. That's logic, because if I play around with the position of the bottom bracket, I will not influence the upper body, and if I modify the position of the upper body, it will not influence my lever system right here of the lower body. Second, if you use polar coordinates, it's really nice, because if I rotate around the pivot, virtual pivot point, as I said, I will not influence the lever system at all. And why it might be interesting to rotate around the hip joint, you know, we saw this weight system, and with a weight system it's possible to figure out where is your center of gravity. So that's really interesting. If you then can figure out where the center of gravity in relation to the bottom bracket is, then of course you can use this as an indicator for a good positioning of your athlete. So with this jig, I'm not talking about different techniques. So you have a lot of different philosophies how to find the correct position of an athlete. So that's not the topic I would like to talk about today. but I want to share these ideas about a perfect positioning jig, because then you might apply or you can use whatever philosophy you like with this jig. But you can, I'm giving you the chance to use the position of the center of gravity as well, because then if you then have a lot of experience with different riders, you may say, okay, my philosophy is like, I want to bring the center of gravity 20 millimeters front of bottom bracket, something like that. So it's really a good indicator, and we will use that indicator if we then later talk about the design of the frame itself, because then we have the fixed points we can focus on, and we have the center of gravity, and we can use that center of gravity as well to then design the frame in a perfect way, so that has something to do with weight distribution on the wheels and something like that. That's really interesting. So number 4 is, so if we modify then the center of gravity, so the center of gravity, we can just rotate around the hip joint. So we will not change the lever system, but we can play around with the position of the center of gravity in relation to the bottom bracket. So that's basically the idea, and you can see it right here. So this is an example where I have the center of gravity right now that's behind bottom bracket, and then I might rotate the whole system to the back, and then of course that would be much more to the back than the bottom bracket, and then that would mean in consequence that the center of gravity is moving forward in relation to the bottom bracket. And then you may use this as an indicator for good position of your athlete. So that are basically the suggestions about how to go forward. And now I would like to show something with a little Excel tool. So as you can see right here, this is an example how you then may operate the whole system. So you might start with a concrete position of an athlete, because if the athlete has a bike and he feels quite comfortable with the existing position on his bike, you may then take his bike and you can just measure the location of the stem center and X and Y coordinates. You can put it in right here. You can measure the X and Y coordinates of the seat clamp center, and that in relation maybe to the bracket center. If you set it to 0, it's then in relation to bracket center. And then this tool would figure out how then you have to set up your jig to then put the rider in exactly the same position on the jig. So that might be a way. So you take the existing frame, you measure these coordinates, you put it in, and then you get exactly the equivalent jig position. And then if you jump onto the jig, you can then of course modify the jig. So the starting point is exactly the same position as at the existing bike configuration, and then you can play around on your jig and you can modify everything. So, and if you do so, because we talked about the center of gravity, it of course is then possible to figure out where is the center of gravity. So this is just a little bit, it's now fantasy value, but what you have to type in then is you need the concrete weight of the athlete, and then you need the weight of the dimension of the weight system without the rider, and then you put the rider in the concrete position on the jig, and then you have the measurement of the system right here. And if you type in all these three values, then of course it's possible to figure out where's the center of gravity. And as you can see right here, it's 109 millimeters in front of bottom bracket, and then you can play around with these values, and maybe it's a helpful indicator for you then to find out and see what is the perfect position of the athlete. Yes, and in the next video then we will focus on the design of the frame. So now we have the concrete position of the athlete, we know where the handlebar and the saddle clamp position is in relation to bottom bracket, we know where the center of gravity is, and we can use all that to design the perfect fitting frame. That's what I will show then in the next episode. So thanks very much for watching. I would be really happy to get some comments and get into a discussion. So thank you very much in advance, and see you soon. Bye bye.